All right, welcome to Lesson 20, Single Dimensional Arrays, also known as lists. In this lesson, you're going to learn how to declare and initialize an array, how to use the values in an array to perform functions, and then also to know the default values of an array. In the Java programming language, they are called arrays, but in some other programming languages, they're known as lists. Okay, so let's say I want to take every student at William Blount High School and store their name. One way would to create a variable, name 1, name 2, name 3, name 4, and so on for 1,800 different students and store their first name. This is kind of very inefficient to store each name in a separate variable. All right, so this is why we have a list that we call an array. So an array is simply a list in which all of its elements are of the same type. So that's important to remember for Java, that the elements have to be the same type. So they all have to be ints, doubles, strings, char, or booleans. So let's look at how an array is organized. So we have the array name. In this case, we've called it names. Each name in the array is called an element. So here's an element, and an element. Each element has a location that we call an index. Now, indexing in Java starts at 0. So this is the tricky part about an array, is remembering that the indexes start at 0. So at index 0, the element is Alex. At index 1, the element is Jess. At index 2, the element is Miguel. All right, we're going to look at how do we create these arrays in our code. There are two different ways to create an array. The first one, you know the size of the array, meaning you know how many elements that you want to put in your array, but you may not know the content of those yet. For instance, you're going to ask the user several questions, and those answers are going to be stored in there. Or you're going to record the temperature each day for an entire year. Well, you don't know in advance what those temperatures are going to be, all right, but you know you want to make an array of 365 days, but we don't know the content. Okay. The other way to create an array is if you know the size and you know the content to start out with. So you know exactly what you want to put in that array. All right, so let's look at how we create an array. We know the size of the array, but we don't have any content to put in it yet. So we start off by saying what kind of data type it is. We use these square brackets to indicate that it's an array. We give the array a name. We assign it using the equal sign, new, that same data type. So those two should be exactly the same. And then the size in the square brackets. All right, so let's get an actual example of this. So here's one for weather. I'm going to create an array called daily temps. I'm going to have the numbers be doubles. I use the square brackets to create the array. Equals new, double. I have to say the type again. And then I want 365 elements in there. Here's another example with string. So I can create an array of strings. This one called CD tracks. This is how old this presentation is. You guys don't even use CD tracks anymore. String, capital S, because string is a class. Square brackets equals new string, and I want 15 elements in there. And here's an example with Boolean. So I'm going to call it answers. The array is going to be of all Booleans. I set it equal to new Boolean, and this time I'm going to have 25 elements in it. All right, so we created some arrays just then. We did not put any values in those arrays, any content. We just said how large the array is going to be. So Java automatically puts in some default values because it doesn't want us to forget to go back and actually give it some values. So it puts in some default values. So these might be intuitive, that if you create an array of doubles, the default value is 0.0. For an int, an integer, the default value is 0. For a string, it is null. And for Boolean, it is false. All right, just to go back and reiterate, we give the type, the data type, square brackets for an array, give the array a name, equals new, the type, so these two types should match, and the size. So this default value, this array right here, I'm not sticking any values in it, but it's going to have 365 elements of the default 0.0. All right, now let's look at how to create an array that we know the size of it, but we also want to go ahead and put some content in it, that we already know what numbers, names we want to put in it. So the left-hand side is exactly the same as before. You give the data type, square brackets, create an array name, okay, equal sign, and now you have to use curly braces. And inside the curly braces, you give the value separated by a comma. That should be a comma right there. So let's take a look at an example here. So let's create an array called odd numbers. I'm going to make them all integers. So I'm going to use int, square brackets to indicate that it's an array, equals, and then I use the curly braces, and I'm going to put in the numbers 1, 3, 5, 7, 9, and 11 into my array. Here is another example with string. I have an array called months, and each element is a string, and I'm going to enter January, February, well, Jan, Feb, Mar, and April. Now with strings, remember, you do have to put them in the double quotes. And here's an example of an array of doubles, and there's some double values. All right, so now you know how to create the arrays in your code, but how do we access these arrays? How do we interact with them? So let's take a look at that. So recall what we said before, that to access a specific location in the array, we have to use its index. So if I want to access Jess here, okay, I would have to use the name of the array, and I would also have to know its index. In this case, it's index 1. So let's practice with this. I have an array called months. The type is string, and I have entered in Jan, Feb, Mar, and April. Now I've gone ahead and listed the index below it. Now normally you wouldn't see this in your code. You just have to know the indexes. So if I was to ask, what is months index 1, okay, there's index 1. What is stored in there is Feb. Months index 4. Well, wait a minute, there is no index 4 over here. This is going to give me an error message. All right, months index 0. Well, I'm going to come up here to index 0, and it holds Jan. Months index 2. There we go right there. That holds Mar. And months index 5, again, that is out of bounds. You are going to get an error message. So if you're compiling and you get an error message that says out of bounds, that's typically what it means is your index is too high for your array. All right, let's look at another example where I've created an array called odd numbers. They're all ints. And I've initialized it. I've put in the values 1, 3, 5, 7, 9, and 11. All right, if I want to change some of these values, all right, the way I do that is I give the array name, odd numbers, then I have to specify the index, and I'm using the equal sign here to assign it. So at this index, I'm assigning it the value 2. Let me grab my pen here. So at index 0, that's right up there where I have a 1. I'm going to replace it now with a 2. Let's look at the next one. Odd numbers, index 1. Well, here's index 1. So remember my indexes. I'm going to write them at the top here. Okay. I'm going to go to index 1 and I'm going to replace it with the number 4. So this becomes a 4. Let's go to the next one. Odd numbers, index 2. So my index 2 is right there. So I'm going to replace it with a 6. So this gets replaced with a 6. So my array now, if I was to print it out, would be 2, 4, 6, 7, 9, and 11. So before we start actually coding with arrays, we're going to practice reading arrays, understanding how to declare them, initialize them, how to read them with indexes. And we're going to do this on paper to practice first before we start coding.